Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Black Economic Alliance Speaker Series. I'm Michael Steele, BEA Advisory Board member and former chairman of the Republican National Committee. As we are gathering right now, it's a solemn time in our country where recent events, including the death of George Floyd and the ensuing protests around our nation, have made every American face the reality that the institution of racism is still a part of American life. A positive side of this experience is that we're having much more frank conversations. We're taking this personally, and we're looking each other in the eye and trying to figure out ways together we can begin to dismantle the systems that have allowed racism and fear to persist to the present day. And what role we now get to play becomes that much more important. It's against that backdrop that we have this week's important discussions with the two major political parties as we chart our path forward. Yesterday, we spoke with the DNC, and today I'm very happy to present and have a part of our discussion, the Republican National Committee. Lest we forget, 2020 is also a presidential election where a slew of important races will take place across the country. During a public health pandemic that has turned traditional plans for campaigning and voting on their head, we again have to find ways that we can begin to exercise that franchise in the fall. I want to give a special appreciation and thanks to Chairman Ronna McDaniel and RNC Senior Communications Advisor for Black Media Affairs, Paris Denard, for joining us for this important conversation. Paris and I, of course, go back a long way, and he worked with me at the RNC back in my time, and the chairwoman and I have been on the campaign trails in the past, fighting the good fight. As we were talking a little bit before, she even voted for me for the U.S. Senate, so brother appreciates that. But this conversation is about big and important things. And is with that, I'm very happy to have them be a part of this program. So I'd like to bring in Gerald Adolph, the moderator, who's going to take us through the conversation today. Gerald, it's all yours.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that introduction. And Ms. McDaniel, Mr. Denard, thank you for joining us today. A couple of questions just to set some context. And really helping people understand the role of the RNC, and as we try to sort through all the different organizations. Two things: what's your role versus all of the other portions of the Republican ecosphere, and also when we looked at President Bush and President Obama, their campaign organizations were quite distinct from the national parties. Yours seems to be operating more synonymously. So today, if you could just help us understand you and Mr. Denard, are you speaking as the campaign? Are you speaking for the varied multitude of voices within the Republican Party? Just sort that out for us.
Sure, thank you so much for having me. And Michael, thank you for that introduction. And just to address what our nation is going through right now, I've really been thinking about it as every American as I've been trying to navigate this with my children, what they're seeing on social media, the unrest that we all feel as Americans, and how can we do better and make this a more perfect union. And my grandfather, George Romney, was the governor of Michigan during the 1967 riots in Detroit. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. And it really was a transformational time in our state to have the National Guard brought in. 43 people died, 2,000 businesses were shut down, and it changed race relations in our state for a long, long time. And one of the things that I'm very proud of my grandfather, George Romney's legacy of as governor was his push for civil rights. He did that as Secretary of HUD and as governor, bringing civil rights into the Michigan Constitution. But also in Michigan, he created a committee called New Detroit, which started to have conversations, which was intended to build conversations between the Black and white community, and how can we do better, and how can we talk about ways we can do better and understand racism and things that really hurt our city and our state. My husband sits on the board of that company today, of New Detroit Today. I just want to express my extreme sorrow for where our country is right now. To see these protests, I'm open to listening and how can we do better, not as Republican or Democrat to fix it. How can we do better as just Americans? But it's disheartening, and I think anybody who watched that video of what happened to George Floyd knows that he was murdered and knows that we need to have justice for his family. And we also know that his family has been very vocal about wanting the violence to end so we can start listening and start healing. So I just wanted to share that. And then I'll move into the RNC.
Yep.
So the RNC is, the political organization that runs the Republican Party. Michael knows this. We don't create policy. We're not the legislative body. People often call me about bills that they want passed. That's not my role. We really create the framework with which to elect Republicans at the federal level across the country. We work with our state parties. A huge portion of my job is raising money so that we can fund that operation. A lot of what the RNC has modeled itself after is actually the Obama 2012 campaign, where he built the community model and really understood the importance of being in neighborhoods early, building relationships so that we can talk to each other about issues and turn out the vote. And that is what the RNC has focused on through our data investments, so we know which voters to talk to, what messages are important to them, and then also building an organization that is bigger than ever right now for the RNC in more communities than ever, and really working to turn out that vote on the Senate, House, and presidential level. Obviously, we're helping the whole ticket when we're turning out the vote. So that's a little bit of what we do. So if you ask me about my ground game in Wisconsin right now, I'll know all that, but I won't know every bill on the House floor, if that gives you a little bit of insight into the RNC. The one difference we've had between, like Gerald mentioned, the Bush campaign or the Obama campaign, who kind of ran separate from the DNC and had their own structure, is we did integrate early with the Trump campaign and created what was called Trump Victory for a couple reasons. At the state level, when I was Michigan chair, we had a state director for the state, and then you had a Trump director, and there was a lot of overlap and redundancy in positions and confusion with the grassroots. So having one set person and not having that redundancy and working in tandem reduces cost, keeps us focused on our goal, and creates clarity for our grassroots as to how we're going to engage with them and turn them out. So we now are at a little over 1,100 staff across the country. We've activated over 1,000,001 volunteers. We'll be at 2 million before the election. And all of that is building up towards turning out the vote in this very complicated, difficult, unprecedented election year like we've never seen in our country's history.
So let me just let me just ask big picture, because you started talking about the history of racism in this country and where we are. And the Republican Party, I'd say since the 60s and the unfortunate advent of the Southern strategy, has struggled with the perception of being at best hostile, at worst hostile, and at best indifferent to the needs of African Americans. So standing where you are now, how are you dealing with that reality? How are you dealing with that perception? I think Ms. McDaniel's from the party point of view. I know Mr. Denard, you've got a particular role in speaking to African Americans.
So I'll let Paris address this as well, but for me, it goes back to my time as Michigan chair, where I really felt strongly that as a party, we weren't reaching out to enough voters. And it's not just about getting the vote, it's about being a better party. And how do we govern and how do we attract new voters if we're not in their communities and not in their neighborhoods? And frankly, as a Republican Party, we don't represent enough minority communities. Part of that's from redistricting. And so we're not part of the conversation in many of these communities across the country. So we opened a Detroit office when I was chair in Michigan. It was open with my predecessor, but we kept it open. And part of that was being part of the community and showing up and having breakfast with the pastors and June 19th events and listening to the community and saying, you know, I know you've been a Democrat your whole life, but you're better off having representation as Black Americans in both parties. And I'm here fighting for your vote, but I also want to be better as a Republican. So I'll just give you one example that was really key to me. We kept pushing job skills and jobs trainings in Michigan, skilled trades and all this. And we had a roundtable in Detroit, and we were talking about skilled trades and all the great things that we were doing to get people into the manufacturing jobs in the auto industry in Detroit. And this one woman raised her hand in our roundtable and said, we can't get driver's licenses in Detroit. Driver's training is so expensive, and our insurance costs in Detroit are so high and prohibitive. We can't even get to the jobs because we don't have public transport. As party chair, I took that back to my governor, Governor Snyder at the time. He said, I've never heard that. That's how the Republican Party gets made better. When we're listening and we're learning and we're fighting for every vote, that helps transform us too. So that's part of what we're doing at the RNC. We've opened urban offices. We're reaching out to the Black community, and we get to talk about things like loan forgiveness for the HBCUs and economic opportunity zones and record low unemployment for the African American community under this president. And the fact that he took the step in a bipartisan way to pass the First Steps Act. Those are things that we can take tangibly to the African American community, and we're going to fight for that vote. And by the way, that's good that both parties are fighting for that vote. And it's going to be small steps, but these are things I care about deeply as chair, and I know Paris can add more to that with his work and what he's doing with the RNC and the campaign.
Well, thank you. Just to begin, this is such a great opportunity for us when your executive director called my cell phone seemingly out of the blue. He knew I was trying to figure out, what do you want us to do? What is this? The DNC is doing something, and he basically said, Paris, we want to have the RNC represented in this conversation to our group, to the BEA, and we want you there, and we want to hear from the chairwoman, and we'd love to have you participate. I took the information, got the invitation, sent it over to the chairwoman, and it was an immediate yes. There was no questions or back and forth about anything. It was, this makes sense, let's do it. And it's because I know that it is part of the heart of our chairwoman, who was successful. She's being modest, but President Trump won the state of Michigan, and many people did not think that could happen. But it was because of the ground game and the listening sessions and the prioritizing of reaching out to all voters that she did on a state level that let President Trump appoint her to 2 terms. This is her second term as the head of the Republican Party. And it is my great honor to have served as Chairman Steele, former Chairman Steele said, with him. But I was so honored when she called and asked me to come aboard to really focus on the Black media as the Senior Communication Advisor for Black Media Affairs, because she recognized that we needed to reach the community everywhere they are. Meaning, if the community is watching Fox News, which we do, CNN, MSNBC, One American News, that's great. But they're also watching the Black News Channel. And in my role, we have fostered a brand new relationship with the Black News Channel and have had, on the Kelly Wright Show specifically, dozens of Black Republican leaders from across the country appear on his program on a regular basis. When we talk about what Black people read, yes, they read the New York Times, the Washington Post. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. We read the Arizona Republic. But growing up, my grandparent, my granny, my papa, we had 2 newspapers that they subscribed to. One was the Arizona Republic, and the other one was the Arizona Informant, which was the Black newspaper. Mm-hmm. And so we understand the importance and value of the Black press. So when the chairwoman wrote an op-ed talking about the Paycheck Protection Program, I said this would be a great opportunity to put it actually to the Black press and see if they'll pick it up without question, without hesitation. Dr. Ben Chavis at Black Press USA, the NNPA, said, we welcome this op-ed. It ran not only on Black Press USA's platform, but it ran in other Black newspapers across the country, because she had a direct message to Black small business owners to try to encourage them. At that time, the focus was on getting the word out that the funding was available. And that was a great step in terms of what I have been asked to do, which is forge new relationships and reassess old relationships and say, we want to engage, we want to be here, we want to talk to you, and we want to listen to you, and we want to engage with you.
So both of you have talked about your efforts to engage, and just in your opening remarks, you both have cited a number of economic things that you want to talk about. And of course, our organization is interested in economics and wealth building for African Americans, work, wages, and wealth being our tagline. When you look at the Republican platform over the years, there has not been a section that speaks specifically to how to close the wealth gap for African Americans, the wealth gap being our households having 1/10 of the wealth of white households. Many of the Democratic competitors, had specific Black economic plans. When we look for this year's platform, can we see something that speaks specifically to African American economics?
Well, if we have a convention, I'm just kidding.
Well, you'll have a platform even without a convention.
No, I'm just kidding. Listen, I think a lot of what I talked about earlier, which is job growth and the fact that we've looked at how do we create better jobs for every American, and what you've seen under President Trump with the record low unemployment, with the African American, Hispanic, Asian, with women at a 66-year low. Part of that is embedded in our platform, which is deregulation, cutting taxes, and giving people the ability to have that innovation and entrepreneurship. I can't say specifically that it's going to be focused on the Black community versus the Hispanic community. We're looking at the country as a whole, but I'll take that back, and I think that's something that's worth discussing.
So let's do that, Matt. If you could just give me a picture for a moment. Let's just pick up on the unemployment as an example. Matt, are you still there? Great.
Okay.
So you guys have seen this data many times. And if you focus on the top line, the blue line on the right, you can see the peak in Black unemployment right after the 2008, 2009 crisis. And if you look at the slope of the line, it's pretty consistent all the way through to pretty much in late 2019, where it starts to plateau a little bit. So when you look at that slope, the question is, what are the specific activities that the Republican Party has undertaken and will endorse that will change the slope of that line, right? There are many who would argue that the slope of that line, both under your administration, the prior administration is largely loose money driven and macroeconomic driven. But what can you do to actually accelerate the slope of that line, and what will the party commit to doing? Matt, you can take that away now.
Well, I will start by saying that, the trend of seeing Black unemployment go down is what we want to see. I know that we can celebrate the fact that under the Trump administration, we saw record low unemployment, but we also can admit the fact that more work needs to be done. And that is why we believe that President Trump deserves 4 more years to continue the work.
And what would we see in the platform and the policy that in the next 4 years then that will make that slope change?
And I think, as the chairwoman mentioned, we don't do policy, but what we do is get behind how the president views the Black community in terms of empowerment. And so you have to look at his background as somebody who is an entrepreneur, as a businessman who understands what it takes to make payroll and to build businesses and build companies and invest in community. And so what I can tell you is that this party will continue to be the party of opportunity, the party of economic freedom and opportunity, focusing on opportunity zones. Part of the criminal justice reform bill which was tremendously historic was the fact that it was focused on reducing recidivism. And the second phase of that is to look at the employment portion of it. there's ban the box and things of that nature that people talk about. And when you look at why criminal justice reform has an economic tie to it, I don't have to tell you something that you already know, but for the sake of the greater audience, we can talk about how imprisonment destroys the Black family, destroys the Black community, and destroys Black wealth because
I think you're spot on, and in fact, I want to come back to criminal justice a little bit later. But just staying with broader economics for a moment, if you looked at those two curves, right, the over time, over a long period of time, the Black curve has pretty much mirrored the white curve, except that it's always at least double, and at bad times at 2.5 times as high. So if we can't do something to change the slope of the curve specifically for African Americans, I understand your comments about the broader populace, but if we can't do something specifically for African Americans, that gap does not go away. So what are the ideas that you think Republicans can bring to bear to change that picture?
Well, one, we're always open to listening to ideas you have, but I just want to talk about a couple of things Paris mentioned. One, the economic opportunity zones that are going to create jobs and bring investment into minority communities, which we're already seeing flourishing. The other fact is the deregulation, and I think that's undervalued. You look at something like Dodd-Frank, which was put in to rein in the banks, but actually had the opposite effect because the big banks, they had the money and the ability to get through all the paperwork. They could hire as many accountants and as many lawyers as they needed to, and it really hurt the community banks that didn't have the financial resources to deal with all the bureaucracy and the lending issues. And who did that affect? Minority communities. They couldn't get the lending, they couldn't start small businesses, and they couldn't be job creators. So by taking back that regulation, and also affected women, by the way, women are huge small business creators. Dodd-Frank alone was a regulatory burden that hurt community banks that had an adverse effect on the African American community by preventing them from being able to be job creators and start small businesses. These are the types of ideas that the Republican Party has espoused and enacted under President Trump. The other thing is trade policy. I think the president focusing on renegotiating NAFTA and USMCA and helping to make sure that more jobs stay in the United States and that we're actually looking at US workers first is something that's going to help every American. So those are things that I would point to that this administration has done that has been part of the reason you have seen more people in the workplace and a reduction or a record low unemployment levels in the African American and Hispanic, Asian, and other communities.
And again, you're absolutely right, an improving employment picture, but again, at the same rate with the persistent gap. So you talk about opportunity zones. In concept, you know, obviously an interesting idea. Enterprise zones thoughts have been around for a while. But the concern has always been that the benefits would flow to the investors and flow out of the community rather than remain in the community. Would you, as a party, support changing tax incentives so that the benefits actually stay in the opportunity zone as an example of a tangible minority directed activity?
Gerald, I will take that to the legislative body of the Republican Party, but I am not a policymaker. So, and I'm not gonna, I really can't act like that's my expertise because that is not what I do, but I will obviously listen to and hear and talk to our legislative officials and say, these are ideas that are being brought to us. But what I will say is we are committed to the Black community and we want to see those things improve. So let's work together. And that's why these types of conversations are impactful long-term, because if we're talking about it, we can be better as a party.
And Gerald, I would just, if I may, I would just say, one of the things that this party is about, when I mentioned earlier about freedom and opportunity, that's why you have, and it's about listening. That's why we have people like Robert F. Smith, Bob Johnson, and other successful Black entrepreneurs who are regularly communicating with this White House, with this administration. The National Bankers Association, as you know, the NBA, which represents all of the tragically low number, but we still have them, thank God, of Black-owned banks, are regularly communicating with this White House because it is important for us to have the insight and to the expertise of these leaders who understand that the focus is creating Black generational wealth, investing in the community. So I would love to see to your point about who gets the investment, I would love to see more Black-owned investment companies come in and take full advantage of the tax laws, take full advantage of the benefits and the things that this administration is doing specifically through SBA and through the Minority Business Development Agency, which, as we all know, was started under the Nixon administration by one of my mentors, Bob Brown. So, who's a Black American and Republican. And so there are things that we can do, and there are things that we would get behind. But at the overarching issue is that we want more people at the table. We want
Mr. Denard, then would you then, if you look at some of the positions, for example, the party has historically been against supplier set-asides and diversity programs. We may spend a lot of money on infrastructure. We may spend a lot of money out of the federal government. Just to back up some of what you're saying, might the party support actually directing some of those and having set-asides and investments in those opportunity zones for minority businesses and for the benefit of minorities?
Well, I would tell you this: you have a president who understands the economy, who understands job creation, and who understands wealth building. And so he's open to all ideas. That's one of the things that I have most admired about not only the Trump White House, but also the Republican National Committee under Ronna McDaniel's leadership, is the fact that we want to bring everybody to the table to get the best deal possible for the community. So when you're talking—
And something like that is legitimately on the table?
What I'm saying is something like that if it's presented to the White House, and if the president feels that it is a good deal for the Black community, this is the type of leader who will get things like that done and put everything on the table and bring everyone to the table. Because as we know, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so we want to have as many people that represent our community, they are present. And I'm proud to say that they're there. That's why, people go back and forth about the issue of diversity. It's having representation and talent. And we have it at the RNC, in headquarters. And we also have it throughout the RNC infrastructure at the state level, and we have it at the White House through MBDA, SBA, as well as the President's Council the Opportunity and Revitalization Council that he started to address these issues well before COVID-19 hit, and moving now that it has hit us on an economic level. This is why this council was created.
So let's do that, which is just another wrinkle on this problem of wealth and security in the African American experience. Obviously, COVID-19 is decimating our communities for a variety of reasons. Density in the way we live, the fact that we're overrepresented in the essential jobs that had to keep going to work, healthcare access and availability, and our own underlying health status. What do you think that the administration and the party, because it's not just the administration, obviously the party and the Senate has to buy on, will be willing to do in the short term to patch that pain in the African American community and to make sure that we don't fall even further behind on those charts you saw?
Well, I would say the president, when he was just in Michigan, convened a panel of African American leaders to talk about this very issue. The fact that coronavirus is adversely affecting the African American community. And I think part of it is getting the research, making sure we understand why, working with the medical experts, and then also putting those resources in. That's why he got rid of copays. That's why he got rid of many of the burdens of people having to pay for testing or the adverse effects of COVID. These are things that the president fought for very early on. And we're going to continue to see this administration. They've already addressed the fact that it's disproportionately affecting the African American community, and they're going to continue to be laying out plans and looking for ways that they can relieve that burden that we've seen so disproportionately affect that community. I don't know, Paris, if you have more that you want to add on that.
Well, certainly, and Paris, please speak to this. Certainly, providing cost coverage for the tests for people who can't afford it, a step in the right direction. What about coverage for just the broader health treatments for people who can't afford them?
Well, I think I think we have to deal with the crisis at hand. And right now, we are dealing with a global pandemic, and we don't have all of the details we don't even have a vaccine yet. So addressing the issue of COVID-19, I think it is powerful step in the right direction and telling everyone in our community, let's just talk about the Black community, if you are underinsured or if you don't have the ability to pay for a test or any type of treatment as if you are impacted by COVID-19, do not worry about it. Go get testing, go get the treatment that you need to survive because the federal government will take care of it. Don't worry about costs. That is important. When you look at what the president has done in terms of the $60 billion in loans for Paycheck Protection Program, that's specifically for minority and disadvantaged communities, with the SBA putting up the $5 billion in round 2 of PPP funding for CFDIs and MDIs, what the Department of Education did, setting up $1 billion that the president signed into law for HBCUs, and to if they experience hardship, they can cover the cost of many of those things. So HBCUs are protected and can hopefully survive COVID-19. When you look at $3.5 billion for childcare for low-income families, it's an all-in approach. There's so many things. When it came to federally supported foreclosures and mortgages, you won't be kicked out of your home because we all know being able to stay in your home is critically important, especially in crisis, because if you don't have a home, you don't have an address, you can't get employment, you can't have an address to do the things that you need to do. And so the president has specifically addressed measures right now to help mitigate the problem of Black people, and especially Black small business owners, not being able to survive during COVID. That's why, and I'll stop after this rioting and this looting and this violence that is being perpetrated in our communities, especially on those small businesses, is so horrible. Because if you're a small business that said, maybe I'll be able to get through COVID-19, I might have got a PPP loan, or I might have got just the grace of God been able to stay afloat. Now these people have come in and have destroyed my business. This is why the looting, it has to stop. So when we talk about the economic conditions of the Black community right now, my mind goes back to 99 years ago, almost to date, with going back to the riots in Tulsa with Black Wall Street. As you all know, I don't have to educate you on this because you know it. That should not have been occurring again 99 years later. When those looters vandalized the Freedman Banks building here in Washington, D.C. That is a disgusting display of ignorance.
Let me, if I may, just ask you a logistical question.
Yeah.
We ran about 10, 15 minutes long with the DNC yesterday. Do you guys have the schedule flexibility to hang around for a little bit?
I actually don't today. I wish I did, but I'm sorry. I have to.
Okay, then we need to touch a couple of other topics.
Right.
I don't know, Mr. Denard, if you have time to stay around. But let me talk about voting, okay? And there's been a lot of written stuff that says, the Republican Party believes it's in their interest for people not to vote. So let's set the record straight, just at a top level. Is it a good thing for more Americans to vote?
Yes.
Is it a good thing for more minority Americans to vote?
Yes.
100%.
Okay. In Pennsylvania, the Republican National Committee sent a mailer with an application for absentee ballots. And the mailer said, and I quote, "Voting by mail is an easy, convenient, and secure way to cast your ballot." Is that the position of the party?
I think this has been very interesting, the way the media and the narrative has come out, where the RNC has really pushed back. On absentee voting or mail-in voting, there's a real distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Every state has absentee voting. They use it for their military men and women. They have processes in place that they've vetted, that they put in place. We don't oppose that at all. Many voters vote absentee. What we are pushing back on is an all mail-in system out of Washington, D.C., taking it away from the states, upending in about 5 months, that we think is upending in 5 months the entire election process, and thinking that that's just not feasible and would create a lot of chaos in the system. The other thing we're pushing back on, and I think this is a big distinction, in states like Nevada and California, they're not even mailing absentee request forms. They're mailing ballots. And they're not mailing ballots to they're mailing ballots to their inactive voters. So what makes you an inactive voter? In Nevada, you're an inactive voter if the post office says this person's moved away after subsequent attempts to contact that person. It becomes clear that that person no longer lives at that address. The DNC has actually sued in that state to send not absentee request forms again, which is part of a verification that that voter is who they say they are, but actual live ballots. And what we've seen in Clark County is—
But this is important because there has been confusion. You do not oppose mailing absentee ballot applications to everyone.
No, I want it at the state level. I'm not going to say I don't want anything done nationally. I like the states with the system.
But we need to be clear because some of the state parties, Republicans, actually have opposed that. So we just want to be clear.
Yeah, we are for what the state guidelines are. We also are not for people expanding their authority. So you have states right now where people are saying, well, we're just going to do this, and they're not going through their legislature and they're not going through their state process. So we're not for just unilateral authority to do that. I think you go through the governing process, but we are not opposed to absentee voting. And many states, every state has that. And I think you should work within the state to make sure it's done in a safe way with the vetting and the process that's already been put in place.
Pennsylvania mailer also said, and I quote, to return the application, quote, to avoid lines and protect yourself from large crowds on election day. Is COVID-19 a valid reason, in the party's view, for an absentee ballot?
You know, we have not opposed states who've been changing their election process through COVID-19, like moving their elections, or some have expanded, like Ohio, some of the mail-in voting. Where we are really pushing back is, one, when you're taking away the choice from some voters who want to vote in person, and two, just the mailing of ballots. And I think this is really important to understand. In California, just in LA County, you have 112% voter registration. So if the governor does what his emergency order is allowing him to do, that means 12% of the people who no longer live there, who are clearly not supposed to be registered, because 112% means that's 1.5 million more than the actual adults in that county. That's 1.5 million ballots just floating around.
And as you know,
fraud in that situation.
As you know, there's been some debate about how that number was calculated, but I just want to be clear.
Okay,
you said you also don't want to take away the ability for people to vote in person. So when localities are closing poll locations and making it more difficult to people to vote on election day or early vote, that would also be something that you would encourage your state parties to oppose.
We want them to work within the state guidelines and use the laws that are put forward by the states. I don't like sudden changes to
but again, just philosophically,
without vetting, without making sure that it's going to.
But philosophically, you will agree that fewer polling places.
Yes, listen, it's the Democrats who have been shutting down in-person voting. That's what they've been pushing at, except when it comes to Nevada, where they're fighting for in-person voting, or in LA, when we just had this special election and it was all mail-in voting until the weekend before the election, and suddenly the governor said, now we're going to open up in-person voting in this one precinct that's a Democrat precinct, without giving notice to Mike Garcia.
So let's go back to the beginning. More people should vote. That's a good thing. Yeah. More minorities could vote. What is the party actually doing to get more minorities registered and turned out to vote? Whatever their vote may be, you can make your pitch and to compete to them, obviously.
We're registering voters every day. We've actually registered double the voters in this election than we did.
Minority voters?
I don't have the statistics on the voters, but we're in every community.
Is there a targeted effort at minority voters?
We're targeting every voter that we come in contact with that's not registered to vote. So we're doing this in Florida, in the Puerto Rican community, in the Venezuelan community. We're doing this in every single state that we're in. We are registering voters to vote that we come in contact with.
I think one thing that's important to know is that all of our rallies, that when we were having these big, massive rallies that the president was attending, the majority of those people that I won't say the majority, high percentages of those persons attending the rallies were Democrats. And we were signing up people to vote at the rallies, registered Democrats. And we are at We have these community centers that are going to be opening up under the chairwoman's leadership. We're hiring staffers. Let's just be real frank. We're hiring Black staffers in Black communities to help lead our Trump Victory leadership initiatives. And we're having trainings, and we're registering people to vote. Yes, we're registering Black people to vote. At our community centers, when they're operational, we have to keep them closed right now because of COVID-19. But as soon as we can open those, in those 15 community centers that the RNC is paying for, that are for the Black Voices for Trump, they will be registering people to vote. Philosophically, like you said, this party wants people to vote. We want Black people to vote. We want Black people to register, because let me tell you the little secret. Black people are coming over to the Republican Party, giving it a first look and giving it sometimes a second look because of the leadership of this president. So we're not like Joe Biden and saying that you ain't Black if you're not supporting us. What we're saying is,
we'll
you
leave.
know that you are Black, and we know that you do.
We'll leave that conversation for cable
I
news.
will add,
Let me, if Ms.
more point,
McDaniel,
though? Can I-
and just in the short time, let me take you back to where you started, talking about the current situation that we're facing in our streets and our communities. President Bush initiated 22 actions under patterns and practices investigations around police misconduct and misbehavior. A system of investigations that's been in place since 1994. The current DOJ won't do any, and Attorney General Sessions pretty much gutted consent decrees as a tool. Party platform, party position. Can we reconsider, or does it make sense in this current environment to go back and reconsider that, as Seattle, for example, is doing?
First, I want to go back to the voting really quick, and I just want to say one thing, Gerald. I want every voter that's eligible to vote to be able to vote. I don't want them to have an impediment to voting, but I also want to make sure that there are safeguards so that voters who shouldn't be voting don't vote. Not voters, people who shouldn't be voting don't vote. And I think that that we have confidence in the vote. You know, what we are seeing systematically from Democrats and the dozen of lawsuits that we're in across the country is a concerted effort to take away safeguards like signature verification, so that you know that the person turning in the ballot is the person it was sent to. These are things that are critical. In a time of uncertainty, we should have certainty in our election process. And that is what we're fighting for. And I think if you look at what the Republicans are putting forward on Protect the Vote, it's very reasonable and common sense. When it comes
if you would, in the short time you have left,
DOJ, when it comes to DOJ and specific practices, listen, this is going to be up to the administration and to Republicans in Congress. I think everybody is opening to listening and looking at ways we can do better. And that is part of the dialogue. And when Paris says, talk to this president, share with him your concerns. This is the thing I know about President Trump, because I've spent a lot of time with him. He will take a phone call from anyone, and he will listen to anyone, and he will be open to any ideas. And that's who he is. And he has been very clear that what happened to George Floyd was a travesty. He has said we want justice for George. And I think the president is very clear that he also wants to make sure that while peaceful protests can continue to happen and should, and they're part of our country, we need this violence and the rioting and the looting to stop. And we need to come together with a conversation.
And is your party clear? Is your party clear that George Floyd is not an isolated incident?
Absolutely.
That this is a pattern and a systemic problem?
Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. You look at all of these.
And is the party also clear that these aren't a few bad apples, that there are systemic issues with the people who protected them and didn't report?
Listen, I talked to a friend of mine today, and she made a point. Her husband, she's African-American. Her husband's an African-American police officer. And she said he was so concerned about policing and the fear that he had of police that he decided to become one to change the system. Okay? These are the types of conversations that we have to have. He had a very difficult situation yesterday. He's in DC. He's a cop in DC. These are the types of conversations we need to have as a country. And when we make it party, oh, Republicans are this and they don't like this. And when you make it a Democrat thing, it makes it much harder to come together to find solutions. So what I will say to you as the Republican chair of the party, we recognize, we are listening, and we will work with anyone to do better. And we will take these messages to the president and to our members of Congress. And that is what we can all hope to do as members of this society who we all know that what happened was wrong, and we all know we need to do better. And that's where we are.
Well, on that note, as we have come to time, I'd simply like to point out that the thrust of many of the questions today, be they economic, voting, criminal justice, which we didn't get as deep into, you have spoken a lot about the broader changes, deregulations and taxes and whatnot that lift all boats. The problem is, as our introducer today, Michael Steele, I've heard say, is that many Black folks don't have boats. In fact, we don't have boats, we don't have wood, and so when the tide of money of, for example, payroll protection came rushing down the river, we were on the shoreline with no boat. So we need some specific African-American programs to help us build boats and take advantage of those initiatives. And to the extent that you'd like some ideas, as you might imagine, we as BEA and the policy work that we're doing would be happy to share some.
That sounds great to me, and appreciate having the conversation and open to more of a dialogue. I would like that to continue.
Thank you. David, are you doing anything in wrap, or are we just saying goodbye? David is not on camera and he's not on mute.
It's
So
all yours. All yours, Joe.
Okay, so let me just say to everyone, please thank you for joining us for this continuing series, and we will have more coming, and we hope you will join us in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.